tried to escape with my affair, but when we arrived at the airport, police and my husband were waiting. Hey Reddit, long-time lurker, first-time poster. I think my story here is worth mentioning, even though it's very personal to me because I've realized that sometimes human beings can be too greedy, and it leads you to do unimaginable things. My name is Vivian, and I am a 29-year-old woman. My husband's name is Richard, and he is a 30-year-old man. We met at a friend's party, but the truth was that I had actually been planning to meet Richard for a while. Some backstory so you understand what I meant. Richard comes from a wealthy family with a complicated history involving his father's extramarital affair and the son born from it, Daniel. Richard's dad didn't want the kid as he felt it would ruin his reputation, so he paid off Daniel's mom to get an abortion. Daniel's mom, however, changed her mind and kept the kid but never told Richard's dad. Daniel, my affair partner, grew up resenting Richard and his family. We met and became friends in high school. While I was popular, Daniel was the quiet, distant kid in class, harboring deep-seated anger. I'll never forget the look on Daniel's face when he finally opened up to me about his past. It was a mixture of sadness, anger, and a deep-seated resentment towards his father and Richard's family. He told me about his struggles growing up, how his mother had to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, all while Richard and his family lived a life of luxury, completely unaware of their existence. Despite the pain in his eyes, I admired Daniel's strength and resilience. We continued to date throughout our early 20s, and our bond only grew stronger. However, as Daniel's resentment towards Richard and his family festered, he began to hatch a plan to take revenge. Daniel's plan was simple yet audacious. He wanted us to take Richard's money and disappear. He had been watching Richard for a while and saw an opportunity in Richard's recent breakup, and believed that I could be the perfect bait to lure Richard in. While I was initially hesitant about the plan, the thought of financial freedom and the chance to escape our difficult lives was too tempting to resist. Our first step was to orchestrate a chance encounter with Richard. I pretended to bump into him at a mutual friend's birthday party, and from there, our plan began to unfold. From Daniel's meticulous observations, he knew exactly how to make Richard believe that our encounter was serendipitous. I pretended to share his interests and hobbies, making him believe that we had a genuine connection. After collecting his number at the party, I took the initiative to call him the next day. Richard seemed interested but cautious. He had just ended a relationship and wanted to take things slow. He was clearly attracted to me, which played perfectly into our plan. I reassured him that I was willing to wait for him, further solidifying his trust in me. Our first date was like something out of a fairy tale. Richard took me to a fancy restaurant and we talked for hours. He was charming, attentive, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. I played my part perfectly, laughing at his jokes and hanging on to his every word. As the evening progressed, I could see that Richard was falling for me. He seemed relieved to have found someone like me after his previous relationship. I, on the other hand, was already planning our next move with Daniel. It was all going according to plan. After dinner, Richard walked me to my car and we shared a sweet, innocent kiss goodnight. Little did he know, it was all part of a plan to take advantage of his trust and steal his money. For our second date, Richard took me to a beautiful art gallery. He knew I loved art, so he thought it would be the perfect place for us to spend time together. We strolled through the gallery discussing our favorite artists and paintings. Richard was so passionate about art, and it was clear that he had a deep appreciation for beauty and culture. After the gallery, we went for a walk in the park. It was a beautiful day, and the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. We sat on a bench talking and laughing, and I found myself really enjoying his company. When the evening came to a close, Richard walked me back to my car. He held my hand and looked into my eyes, and I could see that he was falling for me more and more with each passing moment. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that I was deceiving him, but I pushed it aside. This was all part of the plan to take his money and run away with Daniel. Overall, the date was perfect, and Richard seemed genuinely happy to have me in his life. Little did he know, it was all a lie. For our third date, Richard surprised me with tickets to a musical that I had mentioned I wanted to see. It was such a thoughtful gesture, and I was touched by his thoughtfulness. The musical was amazing, and we both had a great time singing along to the songs and laughing at the jokes. After the show, Richard took me to a cozy restaurant for dinner. We talked for hours, getting to know each other better. Richard shared stories about his childhood and his dreams for the future, and I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone else. When the night came to a close, Richard walked me to my car. He kissed me gently on the cheek and told me what a great time he had. I smiled and thanked him, but inside I knew that I was only using him for his money. Despite my guilt, I couldn't help but enjoy the time I spent with him. On our fourth date, Richard took me to a fancy restaurant in the city. He was charming as always, and I couldn't help but admire how attentive he was to every detail of our evening. We laughed, we talked, and for a moment I almost forgot about our ulterior motives. As we sat there enjoying our meal, I found myself genuinely enjoying Richard's company. He was kind, funny, and incredibly generous. It made me wonder if our plan was really worth it. But then I remembered the life of luxury that awaited me if everything went according to plan, and I pushed those thoughts aside. After dinner, Richard suggested we take a walk in the park nearby. It was a beautiful evening, and the park was almost magical with its twinkling lights and serene atmosphere. We walked hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could be happy with Richard. But then reality came crashing back, reminding me of the real reason I was here. When we walked back to the car, I knew that our plan was still in motion, and that my feelings for Richard were nothing more than a means to an end. In the early stages of Richard and my relationship, Daniel and I had devised a plan to exploit Richard's wealth. However, as I spent more time with Richard, she began to see a different side of him, a side that was deeply in love with me. This realization led me and Daniel to modify our plan. We decided that I would marry Richard, stay with him for a few years, and then divorce him to claim a substantial alimony. Richard's considerable wealth made this a really enticing prospect for us. There was even talk of me getting pregnant to secure child support. However, Daniel quickly dismissed this idea. He didn't want the added complication of a child in our scheme. He expressed his disdain at the thought of having to co-parent with Richard or pay child support if Richard were to gain custody. The risk of our plan backfiring was too great, and so we decided to focus solely on the alimony angle. After dating for a few months, Daniel suggested that I should move in with Richard. I was skeptical, thinking Richard would never agree to such a suggestion. To my surprise, when I mentioned it to Richard, he agreed without hesitation. I was taken aback, but also thrilled at the prospect of being even closer to him. Moving in together wasn't without its challenges. There were times when I needed to come up with excuses to see Daniel, but Richard's love for me made it easy. He trusted me completely, and I took advantage of that trust to continue my affair with Daniel. Despite the guilt I felt, I couldn't deny the excitement of sneaking around and the thrill of being with Daniel. I was living a double life, but Richard's unwavering love and trust in me made it all too easy to continue down this path. As Richard and I continued to date for about a year, Daniel began pushing me to suggest to Richard that he should propose. I was surprised by this suggestion, as I felt their relationship was still relatively new, and I didn't think Richard would agree to such a significant step so soon. However, Daniel was insistent, so I decided to try. I started dropping hints about marriage and a future together, hoping to gently nudge Richard towards the idea of proposing. Richard expressed his love for me and his desire to marry me, but he felt it was still too early to take that step. However, Daniel encouraged me to continue putting pressure on Richard, assuring me that he would eventually give in to my persistence. To my surprise, Daniel's prediction turned out to be correct. I had been talking about our future together for a while, but it still came as a surprise when he finally popped the question. It was a beautiful evening, and we were out for a romantic dinner. As we walked along the beach after dinner, Richard got down on one knee, took out a ring, and asked me to marry him. I was overwhelmed with emotions, joy, excitement, and a hint of guilt. I said yes, but deep down I knew my heart belonged to someone else. Despite my conflicting feelings, I accepted Richard's proposal, knowing it was a crucial step in our plan. Daniel was so excited to hear it when I told him, and he repeatedly said, "I told you so." Meeting Richard's parents was a daunting experience, to be honest. It seemed they had preconceived notions about me, and it was as if they could just smell the gold digger in me from a mile away. Despite all my efforts to please them, they remained aloof and disapproving. Perhaps it was because they had hoped Richard would marry his ex-girlfriend instead. However, Richard always stood up for me, defending me against any snide remarks from his parents, and even threatened not to invite them to the wedding if they didn't stop. Taking Richard to meet my parents was nerve-wracking. They had only known about Daniel, my previous boyfriend, and I had to concoct a story about Daniel and me breaking up long ago. My parents, however, took an instant liking to Richard. They found him charming, funny, and handsome, and they were thrilled about our relationship. During the meeting, my parents almost blew my cover by mentioning that Richard bore similarities to my ex-boyfriend Daniel, who was actually his half-brother. Richard was surprised by this revelation and asked me about it. However, I quickly deflected and told him it was an ex from high school, and even downplayed the similarities. Thankfully, Richard didn't press further, and the meeting ended smoothly, with my parents approving of our relationship and giving us their blessings. I threw myself into planning the wedding because, gold digger or not, I wanted everything to be perfect. I chose an extravagant venue, a beautiful dress, and planned a lavish ceremony. Richard was so supportive, agreeing to whatever I suggested, eager to make me happy. Despite his kindness, I couldn't shake the guilt I felt about deceiving him and my family. The wedding day approached, and I found myself torn between my feelings for Richard and the plan Daniel and I had concocted. I knew I was leading Richard on, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I convinced myself that the end justified the means, that the luxurious future I envisioned for myself after divorcing Richard was worth the deception. Despite my reservations, I continued with the wedding plans, ignoring the nagging doubts in my mind. I was living a lie, but I was so deep in it that I couldn't see a way out. On the day of our wedding, I was a mix of nerves and excitement. Everything was going according to plan, and I was relieved that Richard was none the wiser about my true intentions. As I walked down the aisle in my stunning dress, like I've said before, I felt a pang of guilt for deceiving him, but I quickly pushed it aside. The ceremony was beautiful, and Richard looked at me with so much love and adoration that it almost made me forget about the lies we were built on. We exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other forever, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was capable of keeping that promise. After the ceremony, we had a lavish reception with all our friends and family. Everyone was so happy for us, and I tried my best to be present and enjoy the moment. However, deep down, I knew that our marriage was built on a foundation of lies and deceit. Despite my doubts and guilt, I couldn't deny that a part of me was excited about the prospect of the wealth and freedom that awaited me. After the wedding, Richard and I went on a beautiful honeymoon to a tropical paradise. The resort was stunning, with pristine beaches and luxurious accommodations. We spent our days lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails, and exploring the local area. For a while, it felt like we were in a blissful bubble, just the two of us enjoying each other's company. Richard was attentive and loving, and I tried my best to be the perfect wife. However, beneath the surface, I knew that our marriage was built on a lie. As the days passed, I found myself feeling more and more guilty about what I was planning to do. Richard was so kind and generous, and I couldn't bear the thought of betraying him. But Daniel's words echoed in my mind, reminding me of the life of luxury that awaited me if I went through with our plan. Despite my inner turmoil, I tried to push those thoughts aside and enjoy our honeymoon. Richard deserved to be happy, and I was determined to give him the perfect vacation. After our honeymoon, we returned home, and everything seemed to be going great. Richard was as loving and attentive as ever, and our life together was idyllic. However, I was still sneaking off to see Daniel, and to be honest, I was starting to find him a little annoying. Daniel had always been the driving force behind our plan, but now that we were married, I was beginning to see his true colors. He was becoming increasingly demanding and possessive, and I found myself growing tired of his constant neediness. Despite my growing frustrations with Daniel, I was still committed to our plan. So I continued to see Daniel in secret, all the while growing more and more resentful of his presence in my life. However, I started to notice that taking Richard's money wouldn't be as easy as it had seemed. Richard was no fool. He was smart and astute when it came to finances. Daniel had suggested that we get joint accounts since we were married, and I had brought it up with Richard. Surprisingly, he preferred to keep our finances separate. We did have a joint account, but it was solely for paying bills, which Richard took care of. This was a setback for our plan, as I had hoped to have more access to Richard's money through a joint account. However, I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I knew then that I had to find another way to get my hands on his wealth, even if it meant being patient and biding my time. She also started to notice that Richard wasn't giving her as much money as before. Previously, Richard would give her money to go shopping and other expenses, and of course, Daniel always forced her to split the money. But ever since getting married, Richard wasn't as generous with his money as he used to be, and Daniel had started complaining about it. He accused her of hiding the money that Richard gave her because she didn't want to share it with him. He accused her of trying to cut him out of the deal, which angered her greatly. She took the time to explain to Daniel that Richard wasn't a fool, and that he had probably become more cautious with his finances now that they were married. She told Daniel that he either had to shut up and be patient or risk blowing their cover. Daniel threatened her, saying that if she ever thought of screwing him over, he would tell Richard everything. This threat added another layer of pressure and complexity to our already precarious situation. I found myself torn between my desire to end the deception with Daniel and the fear of the consequences if he exposed our scheme to Richard. The thought of losing the luxurious life I had become accustomed to filled me with dread, so I just had to go on with what Daniel wanted. As time went on, getting money from Richard became increasingly difficult. I had no legitimate excuse to ask for money, especially since Richard knew my family so well. I couldn't fabricate any stories about them to get money from him. Since I didn't work and Richard paid all the bills, I was essentially a stay-at-home wife. Whenever we went shopping, Richard usually paid with his card and made most of the purchasing decisions because he had a better eye for quality and style. My dependency on him was becoming more evident, and it made me feel trapped and frustrated. Daniel's complaints grew louder and more persistent. He had become overly reliant on the money I received from Richard, to the point of quitting his job and refusing to pursue anything substantial. With the supply from Richard dwindling, Daniel's desperation grew even more. He constantly badgered me for more money, adding to my stress and guilt. His demands were becoming unbearable, and to be honest, annoying. Daniel's suggestions became more extreme as he urged me to sell my expensive belongings, bags, shoes, jewelry, to get more money. He even suggested pawning them off, claiming he could do it discreetly. However, I knew that such actions would not go unnoticed by Richard. How could I explain to him that I had sold off my possessions, especially when he provided everything I needed? It was a risky and desperate proposition that I couldn't bring myself to consider. Daniel's behavior became increasingly reckless. He would call and text me incessantly, even when he knew I was with Richard. It felt as though he was deliberately trying to get us caught. His suggestions grew more absurd, like suggesting that staying with Richard for years was too long, which contradicted our initial plan. It was frustrating and nerve-wracking, as his actions were jeopardizing everything we had worked for. Daniel's boldness reached new heights when he suggested blackmailing Richard's parents for money. He planned to reveal himself to Richard's father, claiming to be his illegitimate son, and demand money to keep quiet. Despite my warnings, Daniel was determined to go through with it unless I could get the money from Richard for him. However, Richard's parents didn't react as Daniel had hoped. They didn't care about his existence or offer any money. Surprisingly, they didn't even tell Richard about Daniel's claim. I expected them to eventually reach out to Richard, but they never did. It seemed they were too ashamed to admit to Richard that he had a stepbrother. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to abandon Daniel. He was my first love, and I had known him for so long. In a way, I owed him, as I never would have met Richard if not for him. So, despite his increasingly erratic and selfish behavior, I stayed with him, unable to let go of the past and the memories we shared. Despite everything, Richard seemed oblivious to my affair. I was surprised he hadn't caught on, but looking back, I realized he was likely biding his time. There were moments when I would lie to Richard, saying I was staying at my parents' or visiting them, only to sneak off to see Daniel. Then, by some crazy coincidence, my parents would call Richard to say hello, blowing my cover. I only learned about these instances from my parents after everything came to light. There were even times when I claimed to be going out with a friend, only for that friend to unexpectedly show up at our house, further complicating my web of lies. However, things took a turn when Richard came home one day looking visibly upset. He broke the news that we needed to downsize and that he was already looking for a buyer for our house. I was stunned. Our house was magnificent, with 7 bedrooms, a swimming pool, a movie theater, everything we could ever want. Richard explained that he had made some serious mistakes at work, and things were now going downhill. He was too proud to ask his parents for help, so downsizing seemed to be the only option. Reluctantly, I agreed to the plan. I needed to play the role of a good wife, so I had no choice. We moved out of our dream home and into a modest 3-bedroom house. This change also shocked Daniel. He was torn between feeling glad that Richard was losing money and being angry that our plan was going down. With Richard's finances dwindling, the money I used to receive from him also decreased significantly. He was still covering the bills and all our expenses, but I was no longer receiving much in terms of spending money, which greatly affected Daniel. I advised Daniel to find a job since it was clear we wouldn't be receiving much from Richard anymore. I wasn't too worried, assuming Richard could always turn to his parents for help if things got too dire. I missed my lavish lifestyle, but I trusted Richard's intelligence to recover financially. My plan was to play the role of the perfect wife, so that when Richard did recover, he would look back on this moment, think about what a good wife I had been, and reward me generously. My plan was foolproof, or so I thought. However, a few weeks after downsizing, Richard informed me that things were worsening. I was shocked, honestly. At that point, I was now thinking of just bailing on him. There was no way I could suffer for him. I asked him to ask his parents for help, but he still refused. He suggested selling my expensive bags and jewelry, which I vehemently opposed. We argued, and he accused me of selfishness, and then posed a choice between homelessness with my luxurious items or modest living with more modest possessions. Reluctantly, I agreed to sell my belongings, including my Birkin bag. Daniel was furious when he heard about this, insisting that we should abandon Richard before he dragged us down with him. Daniel continued to insist that Richard would never recover the millions he had lost. He pointed out that we had already sold our home, downsized to a modest house, and sold all my jewelry and bags, indicating a significant financial setback for Richard. Daniel argued that Richard was in bad shape financially, and that recovery was unlikely. Initially, I tried to refute his claims, but his arguments began to make sense. Realizing the gravity of the situation, I knew I needed to leave Richard before his financial troubles dragged me down with him. However, I couldn't just leave without money. Daniel was also broke because he had refused to work. Daniel then proposed a risky plan. We would take as much money as we could find from Richard, possibly $100,000 or even $50,000, and flee the country. He argued that American police only had jurisdiction in their country, and that if we left America and never returned, they wouldn't be able to catch us. He also believed that Richard's pride would prevent him from reporting us to the police out of shame. He said we would research and travel to a country where their currency was very low, and so the dollar rates would be really high. He said with the money we had taken from Richard, we would love like kings and queens. Despite my reservations, I ultimately agreed to the plan. The first step of our plan involved me gaining access to Richard's card or his bank app to make the transfer. Daniel took charge of researching and buying the plane tickets for our escape. On the day of our escape, I had to take Richard's phone and card, which, looking back, was a very foolish move. We drove to the airport in my car, which Richard had bought for me, and made the transfer to my account. The plan was to dispose of Richard's phone and card once we landed. Daniel was ecstatic, thinking we would finally be rid of Richard. However, when we arrived at the airport, to our shock, Richard and the police were waiting for us. Richard looked amused, calling me every name in the book. The look on both mine and Daniel's faces when we saw them was priceless. As the police tried to arrest us, Daniel still tried to embarrass me, shouting that Richard owed him everything, claiming he was deprived of a good life. He refused to be arrested and threatened to punch anyone who came near him. Meanwhile, I, eager to save myself, just started crying and begging Richard, telling him Daniel forced me, that I didn't mean it and I loved him. Richard just laughed, calling me a liar. He said he had been watching me for a while, calling me stupid and foolish for going along with everything Daniel said. Daniel, shocked by my betrayal, started screaming at me, calling me a lying bitch and a betrayer. He even compared me to Delilah from the Bible, which I now find hilariously ironic. I was shocked and terrified as the police arrested the both of us. I was handcuffed and escorted away, my mind racing with thoughts of the consequences of my actions. I felt a deep sense of regret for betraying Richard and for getting involved in Daniel's scheme. As we were taken into custody, I could literally see the disappointment in Richard's eyes. I knew I had lost his trust and love forever. The reality of my actions hit me hard, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame and guilt. In the police car, I sat in silence. My mind replayed the events that led to my downfall. I realized that she had been blinded by greed and had made a series of terrible decisions that had led to this moment. As we arrived at the police station, I was processed and placed in a cell. I sat alone in the cold, dimly lit room, the weight of my actions heavy on my shoulders. I knew that I had lost everything: my marriage, my freedom, and my dignity. I had betrayed Richard, the man I had once loved, all for the promise of a more luxurious life with Daniel. Now, I was alone, facing the consequences of my actions. I knew that I had made a terrible mistake, one that I would regret for the rest of my life. I sat in the cold, sterile cell, and the reality of my situation sank in. Richard had actually gone through with it. He was charging me with fraud. The police officers informed me that they would set a date for the trial, and until then, I was eligible for bail. I immediately called my family. My voice was trembling as I explained what had happened. My parents rushed to the station, their faces a mix of shock and concern. They had no idea I was in such a predicament. As they bailed me out, I could see the worry in their eyes. They asked about Richard, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them everything just yet. I promised them I would explain everything once we were home, but Danny, no one came to bail him out. His mom didn't have the money, and he was in no position to afford it himself. He was stuck in jail, left to deal with the consequences of our actions alone. It was a stark reminder of the mess we had gotten ourselves into. After I was released, I went to visit Daniel. I told him that my parents had bailed me out, but he was angry and demanded that my parents or I bail him out too. I refused, and he started screaming at me, blaming me for everything. He said that was why he had been cheating on me, and I was shocked. We had been in a serious relationship, and I didn't expect him to react this way. Richard and I had been an exception, obviously, and besides, Daniel had been the one to come up with the plan. I blamed him for everything, telling him that he was the reason we were in this situation in the first place. It was a painful realization, but I knew that our relationship was over. I had been foolish to think that Daniel was the answer to my problems. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the blame, it was all too much. I again reminded Daniel that everything was his fault, and with that I stormed out of the hospital room, leaving Daniel behind. I knew then that I had been extremely stupid, that I had been blind to his true intentions. It was time to make things right, starting with my marriage to Richard. After being released from jail, I had no choice but to go back to my parents' house. I knew there was no way Richard would let me back into our home. My parents were shocked when I told them the whole story. They were extremely disappointed in me, and I could see the hurt in their eyes. I begged my parents to come with me to beg Richard to drop the charges. I knew that if he did, I wouldn't have to go to jail. My parents agreed, but they told me to give Richard some time to cool off first. I spent the next few days at my parents' house trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. I couldn't believe how badly I had messed up my life. I had lost Richard, the man I had once loved, and I had almost lost everything else too. After spending a few days at my parents' house, I decided to go check and clear out Daniel's apartment. Everything in that apartment was bought with the money I had taken from Richard, so I felt I had a right to it. Plus, I was still very angry at Daniel for everything that had happened. When I got to the apartment, I started to see signs that I had ignored before. There was laundry and female clothing that was obviously not mine. It became clear to me that Daniel had been bringing numerous people over while we were together. I felt a mix of anger and betrayal wash over me. I couldn't believe that I had been so blind to what was happening right under my nose. I had trusted Daniel, believed that he loved me, but it was all a lie. As I cleared out the apartment, packing up the things that were rightfully mine, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I was glad to be rid of Daniel and all the lies and deceit that came with him. Leaving the apartment for the last time, I knew that I had made the right decision to leave him behind. I was ready to move on with my life, to learn from my mistakes and never let myself be deceived like that again. Then after a few more days that felt like an eternity, my parents agreed to accompany me to see Richard. I texted him, pleading for a chance to meet and talk things over. To my surprise, Richard responded. He didn't have me blocked, and he agreed to meet with my parents. I thought maybe there was a glimmer of hope that we could somehow salvage our relationship. But when he sent me the address, it was our old house, the one he had supposedly sold. I knocked on the door and Richard answered. His expression quickly turned to anger, but he let us in. I started begging him to listen to me, to give me a chance to explain. I told him how sorry I was, how I regretted everything that had happened. But Richard was unforgiving. He told me that he couldn't trust me anymore, that he couldn't believe anything I said. I pleaded with him, begged him to reconsider, but he just shook his head. My parents tried to intervene, but Richard was adamant. He told us to leave, that he never wanted to see me again. My parents were desperate to mend the situation. They even pleaded with Richard to at least drop the fraud charge. They hoped that he could find it in his heart to show some mercy, to consider the years we had spent together. But Richard was resolute. He refused to budge, his face cold and unmoved. It was clear that he had made up his mind, that he was determined to see this through to the end. He said that he had already filed the charges against me and that it was out of his hands now. As I watched my parents plead with him, I felt a mix of sadness and anger. Sadness because I could see the pain in their eyes. the disappointment at seeing their daughter's life fall apart, anger because Richard's stubbornness felt unjust, his refusal to forgive and move on tearing our family apart even further. However, before leaving, I asked Richard one last question. I asked him how come he was still here in our old house when he had reportedly sold it. Richard laughed, and that was when he actually told me another shocking truth. That's when I realized Richard had screwed me over. He had never lost any money. The whole thing was a charade, a cruel game to mess with me and Daniel. I was stunned. Richard's deception cut deep. He had played me for a fool, made me believe that our life together was over, all for his own twisted amusement. I felt a mix of anger and betrayal, realizing that Richard had never intended to give me a second chance. My parents and I left, and I felt a sense of finality wash over me. I knew that I had lost Richard for good, that there was no going back. I had destroyed everything I had ever cared about, all for a foolish dream of a better life. Now, all I could do was face the consequences of my actions and try to rebuild my life from the ruins I had created. It was a daunting task, but I knew that I had to try. Best advice I'd give anybody is to please not try and play any stupid game like I tried to do. If you have a good spouse, keep them. I'm still awaiting trial and I am terrified for my life. I know it's over for me. Thanks for listening.